The heavy, salt-laden wind of Busan howled through the concrete canyons of the shipping district, turning the evening rain into a biting, horizontal mist. Han Tae-kyung adjusted the platinum watch on his wrist, but the metal felt like a shackle rather than a trophy. He had been lured to this coastal city with the promise of a $40 million expansion, a deal intended to solidify his legacy. Instead, he found himself staring into the cold, steel-gray eyes of his own lieutenants as they drew their blades in the shadows of a deserted warehouse. "The king is old," his business partner, David Chen, sneered as the first strike landed. "And a king without a pure heir is just a man waiting to be replaced." Moments later, Tae-kyung collapsed into the slushy darkness of a side street, his hand pressed against a jagged wound in his side. The Tiger of Daegu was bleeding out on Busan's soil, abandoned by the men he had bought with fear. As his vision blurred, he saw a woman moving carefully through the rain, her auburn hair pulled back, carrying a small bag of groceries. He recognized that profile, the curve of her neck and the deliberate, graceful way she walked. It was Alani. 5 years ago, he had stood in his Daegu penthouse and told her she was pathetic and unworthy of his family name. Now, she was the only witness to his end. Alani froze, the color draining from her face as she recognized the man who had destroyed her husband's life. For a heartbeat, Tae-kyung expected her to walk away, to let the cold claim him as he had once claimed her sense of security. Instead, she knelt in the slush. She didn't reach for his watch or his wallet. She stripped off her own heavy wool coat and wrapped it around his shivering frame. "Why?" he wheezed, the words tasting like ash. Alani didn't look away. "Because unlike you, Han Tae-kyung, I know that a person's worth isn't measured by who they can step on, but by who they are willing to pick up. More so, my daughter has your eyes," she whispered, her voice a low rumble against the storm. "And I will not have her grow up in a world where we leave even the heartless to die in the cold." The memory of that afternoon in Daegu returned to Han Tae-kyung with the jagged clarity of a broken mirror, a stark contrast to the freezing alleyway in Busan, where he now lay dying. It was 5 years ago, in the soaring, glass-walled penthouse that overlooked the sprawling industrial heart of his territory, a city he had conquered with a cold, ironclad belief in the purity of his legacy. The sun had been setting then, casting long, predatory shadows across the marble floors, much like the streaks of light that had once illuminated his midnight black sedan. He had summoned his son, Baek Jung-kyung, for what was supposed to be a strategic finalization of his marriage to Kwon Murray, a high-status union designed to solidify the tiger's reign for another generation. Instead, Jung-kyung had entered the room with a woman whose presence acted as a silent, defiant challenge to everything Tae-kyung stood for. Alani Brooks stood beside his son, not with the cowering posture of a maid, but with a quiet, breathtaking dignity that made the penthouse's luxury feel suddenly gaudy and hollow. "Father," Jung-kyung began, his voice possessing a steady resonance that Tae-kyung hadn't heard before. "I am not here to discuss the Kwon merger. I am here to tell you that I have already made my choice. This is Alani. She is my wife." Tae-kyung didn't move. He sat in his leather chair, the platinum watch on his wrist ticking away the seconds of his silence like a heartbeat. His steel-gray eyes scanned Alani with a surgical necessary cut, dismissing her auburn hair and dark skin as if they were stains on a clean canvas. To him, she was a disposable shadow, a woman who had worked in the periphery of his life and had now dared to step into the center of his bloodline. "You chose a maid," Tae-kyung finally rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the air in the room turn 10 degrees colder. "You chose an embarrassment over an empire." "I chose a miracle," Jung-kyung countered, his hand tightening around Alani's. "I chose a woman who sees me, not just the name you gave me. I chose the humanity you've spent your whole life running from." The insult hit Tae-kyung harder than any physical blow he had ever received in the violent hierarchy of the underground. He stood slowly, his shadow looming large and terrifying against the glass walls. He was a man who measured life in cold calculations and social dominance, and his son was offering him the one currency he didn't know how to spend: unconditional love. "You will listen to me very carefully," Tae-kyung stated, his authority wrapping around the room like a physical weight. "You think this is a romantic rebellion. It is a suicide mission. If you walk out of that door with her, you are no longer a Han. You are no longer my heir. You will have no home, no money, and no voice in this city." He looked at Alani, his gaze turning, cold enough to rival the winter wind. "And you think you've climbed a mountain. You've only climbed a scaffold. You will be the reason he starves. You will be the reason he becomes a ghost in his own city." Alani didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her green eyes searching his face with an intensity that cut through his Mafia-bred armor. "You speak of bloodlines as if they are sacred, Han Ti-kyung," she said quietly. "But a bloodline that requires the death of a son's heart is nothing but a curse. You aren't protecting a legacy, you're building a tomb." Ti-kyung's grip tightened on the edge of his desk. The ultimatum was final. "Leave, now, and do not think to look back when the cold begins to bite." He watched them walk away, their silhouettes shrinking as they crossed the marble expanse toward the elevator. He had thought he was winning a war of wills, that he was preserving the integrity of the tiger. He didn't realize that in that single, cruel instant, he had erased 3 decades of devotion and traded his only son for a hollow empire of gold and glass. As the elevator doors hissed shut, the silence that followed felt like the slamming of a coffin lid, the finality of it breaking his heart into 1,000 pieces he was too proud to count. He returned to his window, looking out at the neon-drenched streets of Daegu, unaware that 5 years later, the same woman he had discarded would be the only thing standing between him and the end of his life on a dark Busan street. The weeks following the disownment in Daegu had been a masterclass in suppressed agony. Han Ti-kyung had returned to his routine with the mechanical precision of a man who believed that if he ignored the hole in his life, it would eventually scar over. But when his informants whispered that Baek Jung-kyung was to be married in a small, coastal chapel on the outskirts of Busan, the tiger found himself unable to stay behind his fortress of gold and glass. He guided his midnight black sedan through the neon-drenched, snow-dusted streets, not as a guest, but as a ghost haunting the ruins of his own legacy. He brought the car to a silent, smooth stop across the street from the weathered wooden church. The ocean air was thick with salt, and the biting wind, that seemed to have followed him south, rattling the frame of the sedan. Inside the leather-scented cabin, the cold metal of his platinum watch was a familiar, heavy weight against his skin, ticking away the minutes of a ceremony he was actively choosing to miss. He sat in a heavy, contemplative silence, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the chapel doors. The wedding was nothing like the high-society gala he had planned for his son. There were no high-status guests, no designer sunglasses perched on elegant noses, and no 2-month waiting lists for a restaurant. It was a modest affair, attended by people Ti-kyung viewed as disposable shadows, neighbors, a few friends from the freelance world where Jung-kyung now labored, and Alani's sister, Claire. When the doors finally opened, the sunlight hit the couple with a radiant expression that made Ti-kyung's breath catch. Jung-kyung was dressed in a simple suit, lacking the tailored perfection of a Mafia prince, but his face held a soaring sense of achievement that Ti-kyung had never seen during their years in the Daegu penthouse. Beside him, Alani was a miracle in a dress of simple white lace. She didn't look like a pathetically small maid. She looked like a woman who had built something unshakable inside herself. Ti-kyung's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He could see them laughing, the soft, mewing sounds of the distant gulls punctuating their joy. It was a scene of uncomplicated happiness, a luxury he had traded for power and money. He realized then that his son wasn't just marrying a woman, he was marrying a life where simplicity felt like the ultimate luxury. A sharp, insistent pang of regret pierced his chest, but his fatal flaw of pride acted as a surgical shield. He told himself that this was a suicide mission, that the bone-deep chill of reality would eventually break them. He watched as Jung-kyung leaned in to kiss his bride, a gesture of fierce, breathless love that felt like a physical blow to the man watching from the shadows. Ti-kyung reached for the ignition. He could have stepped out. He could have walked across the slushy pavement and ended the years of silence before they even began. But the king of the underground was a prisoner of his own stony and impassive mask. He chose the surgical, necessary cut over the messy beauty of forgiveness. "You have the right to live the life you chose," he whispered to the empty car, throwing his son's own future words back into the void. He shifted the car into gear, the engine letting out a low, dangerous vibration. As he drove away, the chapel shrinking in his rearview mirror, Tae-kyung felt his heart undergo its own, silent, smooth stop. He was returning to a city that bowed to his name. But as the neon-drenched lights of Busan faded, he knew he was heading back to a hollow empire, where the only thing he truly owned was the cold. He had preserved the purity of his bloodline, but in doing so, he had ensured that his legacy would eventually end in a heavy, contemplative silence. In the months that followed the seaside wedding, Han Tae-kyung operated like a man trying to exercise a phantom limb. He threw himself into the mechanical precision of his Daegu operations, overseeing the violent hierarchy of his territory with a surgical coldness that left his lieutenants in a state of constant, rigid bows. Yet, the silence of his penthouse, a monument to his success, filled with dark wood and high-tech security, began to feel less like a fortress and more like a tomb. He found himself obsessing over the unworthy woman who had stolen his heir, convinced that Alani Brooks was merely a predator who had climbed a scaffold to reach the Han fortune. He was certain that every person had a price, and he intended to find hers with the same lethal intensity he used to sign corporate contracts. Tae-kyung traveled to Busan not with a blade, but with a checkbook, intending to perform one final, surgical cut that would separate his son from the Maid forever. He summoned Alani to a private suite in a high-end hotel overlooking the Hyundai coast, a space that smelled of clean cedarwood and expensive oolong tea. He sat in the shadows, his steel-gray eyes focused on the door as she entered. Alani looked different than she had in Daegu. The bone-deep exhaustion of working freelance jobs while supporting a husband who had been stripped of his inheritance was visible in the slight curve of her shoulders. However, when she sat across from him, she didn't shrink into herself. "I will make this simple," Tae-kyung rumbled, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to drop the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He slid a leather-bound folder across the marble tabletop, containing an amount of money that could buy a midnight black sedan for every day of the year and a penthouse in every major city in the country. "This is the price of your disappearance. You will take this, you will leave Busan, and you will never speak my son's name again." "You are a disposable shadow, Alani. Don't waste your life trying to pretend you are royalty." Alani didn't even open the folder. She looked at the platinum watch on his wrist, a cold weight that measured a life Tae-kyung thought was superior, and then she looked him directly in the eye with a lethal intensity of her own. "You think you are offering me a fortune," she said, her voice a melodic, soothing cadence that held an edge of steel. "But all I see is a man who is so poor he thinks money can buy the one thing he threw away." "Don't be a fool," Tae-kyung snapped, his stony and impassive mask beginning to crack. "You are living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment with walls painted warm yellow, while he could be living in a gleaming, smart tech-filled penthouse. You are keeping him in the cold." "We aren't in the cold," Alani countered, standing slowly with a fierce, breathless love radiating from her posture. "Our home is a fortress of light because it is built on truth, not cold calculations. Jung Kyung has a soaring sense of achievement every day because he is no longer a ghost in his own city. He is a man who is loved for his heart, not his social dominance." She pushed the folder back toward him. "Keep your hollow luxury, Han Tae-kyung. My husband chose a miracle, and I will not let you turn his life back into a tomb." She walked toward the door, her head held high, leaving Tae-kyung alone in the heavy, contemplative silence of the hotel's suite. He had spent decades building an empire of shadows, believing that authority was absolute, yet he had just been defeated by a woman who owned nothing but her dignity. As the door clicked shut with a finality that broke his heart, Tae-kyung stared at the uncashed millions. For the first time, the material evidence of his success felt vast and hollow. He had tried to buy her soul, but he had only succeeded in revealing the cowardice of his own. He returned to Daegu that night, the neon-drenched lights of the city offering no warmth, realized that while he had disowned his son, it was he who was now truly abandoned in a world of his own making. The 5 years that followed the failed bribery in Busan were defined by a mechanical precision, so absolute it bordered on the pathological. Han Tae-kyung retreated into the high-rise sanctuary of his Daegu penthouse, a space filled with dark wood, floor-to-ceiling glass, and a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight against his chest. He adjusted his platinum watch every morning with the same cold metal familiarity, yet the ticking of the seconds no longer felt like progress. It felt like a countdown in a tomb he had built with his own hands. He had successfully preserved the purity of his lineage by excision, but the cost was a hollow empire, where the only voice he heard was the echo of his own commands. He occupied his days with high society dates and conversations that never ventured into territory he wasn't willing to explore, surrounding himself with people like Choi Ara, beautiful, high status, and entirely uncomplicated. But even as he sat in restaurants with 2-month waiting lists, he found himself distracted by the biological math of his own regrets. Every time he saw a toddler in a pink winter coat or a father pushing a stroller through a rain-slicked park, his stony and impassive mask would flicker, revealing a man who was running from the only legacy that actually mattered. He had become a king in a hollow empire, ruling over a vast network of blood business and renewable energy contracts. Yet he was paralyzed by the realization that his success was a monument to his isolation. His penthouse, once a gleaming, smart tech-filled symbol of his absolute authority, had transformed into a museum of isolation. He moved through the rooms like a ghost haunting his own living room, staring at the marble counters and sterile corridors that lacked the warm yellow, light, and toddler chaos he had glimpsed in the life his son had chosen. There were no children's books stacked on a reclaimed wood coffee table here, no delicate mobile of paper cranes hanging in the corner to catch the afternoon sun. Instead, there was only the cold diamonds of the city lights reflecting off the glass, a grid of light that offered no warmth to a man who had confused being busy with being effective. The silence between father and son was more lethal than any threat Tae-kyung had ever issued in a boardroom. He had spent decades believing that power and money could buy almost anything, but he could not buy back the 5 years of first steps and milestones celebrated without a witness that he had missed. He had Google searched Jung Kyung exactly once, seeing his son looking entirely unencumbered by the Mafia weight, and had closed the laptop with a surgical finality, terrified of the sting of rejection. He realized now that his son's silence wasn't just an absence. It was an act of war against the cold philosophy Tae-kyung had inherited from his own father. As the third winter approached, the bone-deep exhaustion of maintaining his mask began to show. His lieutenant's men, who moved like shadows and valued consistency and discipline above all else, began to notice the sudden, icy distance in their leader. Tae-kyung sat in his leather-scented sedan, watching the pedestrians navigate the slushy intersections of Daegu, and felt a crushing weight of envy for the modest lives he had once labeled pathetic. He was a sovereign in the Daegu underground, but as he looked at his reflection in the visor mirror, he saw only a man who had been running. He had built a fortress of cold luxury, but he was freezing in the dark, waiting for a miracle he had already thrown away. The transition from absolute power to a state of creeping vulnerability was a slow, agonizing process that Han Tae-kyung at first refused to acknowledge. In the high-stakes world of the Daegu underground, authority was not just about the platinum watch on a man's wrist or the midnight black sedan that carried him through neon-drenched streets. It was about the perception of unshakable, lethal consistency. For decades, Tae-kyung had been a stony and impassive mask, a leader who measured life in cold calculations and surgical cuts. But as the 5-year mark of his son's exile passed, the museum of isolation he called a home began to sap his edge, and the men who moved like shadows in his wake began to notice the cracks. The betrayal did not start with a gunshot, but with a series of subtle, rhythmic shifts in the loyalty of his senior management team. Men like David Chen, who had spent years bowing to Tae-kyung's steel-gray eyes and lethal clarity. He had always believed blood without obedience was weakness. He started to communicate in the muffled, sharp vibrations of private conversations that ended the moment the tiger entered the room. They saw a man who was increasingly distracted. A leader who would stare absently out of floor-to-ceiling windows toward the horizon as if hunting for a truth that threatened to incinerate his existence. To the predatory lieutenants of the Daegu hierarchy, T. Kyung's bone-deep exhaustion and sudden, icy distance weren't signs of a man seeking peace. They were the smells of blood in the water. The Busan deal, the $40 million renewable energy expansion that was supposed to be his legacy's crowning achievement, became the flashpoint for this internal erosion. While T. Kyung was paralyzed by the memory of a toddler's eyes or the melodic cadence of a voice he had tried to silence, his lieutenants were tallying his missing calls and rescheduled meetings. David Chen, once his most trusted partner, began to voice his frustration with a jagged laugh, openly questioning if the CEO had checked out. They saw the restructuring of his role as a surrender, a breakdown rather than the breakthrough T. Kyung believed it to be. In a world built on power and money, a leader who admits to having other priorities besides the empire is a leader who is already viewed as disposable. The heavy silence in the boardroom was no longer a sign of respect, but the quiet of a gallows. T. Kyung's insistence that success in any endeavor requires commitment beyond feelings had been turned against him. His men, who valued consistency and discipline above all else, began to view his Wallingford vow, the quiet promise to choose presence over, as a terminal weakness. They whispered that the tiger had grown old and human, two traits that were incompatible with the violent hierarchy they occupied. They saw his unencumbered freedom as a myth and his isolation as an opportunity to claim the hollow luxury he had spent 40 years building. By the time the winter air turned biting and horizontal, the conspiracy was a grid of cold diamonds that had already ensnared him. T. Kyung would sit in his office, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows, unaware that the very men who snapped into rigid bows, when he passed, were already coordinating with rivals in Busan. He was too used to suffering the quiet loneliness of his penthouse to notice the lethal finality of the traps being set for him. The king of the underground was still wearing his platinum watch, but he was now a man who had been running out of time. The empire wasn't just cracking, it was preparing to collapse under the weight of its own cold steel and glass, leaving the tiger with nothing but the debris of a morning routine he had never actually known. The transition from the absolute power of the Daegu underground to the jagged vulnerability of a broken stranger was a trap built with the very mechanical precision Han T. Kyung had taught his subordinates. The ambush began with a series of urgent, jagged vibrations from his secure line, notifications that had once been the sacred focus of his 18-hour days. David Chen, his lead lieutenant and the man who had been packing at the head of the mahogany table during T. Kyung's frequent lapses in concentration, presented a contract that seemed too lucrative to ignore. A $40 million expansion into the Busan shipping district that promised to be the ultimate crowning of the Han legacy. T. Kyung guided his midnight black sedan toward the coast, the neon-drenched lights of Busan reflecting off the dashboard as the salt-heavy air of the sea began to replace the sterile scent of his Daegu penthouse. He felt a strange, soaring sense of achievement as he crossed the city limits, believing he was finally securing a future that might allow him to reach out to Jung Kyung from a position of absolute stability. He was so consumed by the biological math of his own regrets and the mature finality of his past choices that he failed to notice the heavy silence of his security detail or the way his trusted men followed in a confused, silent procession that lacked their usual rigid discipline. The meeting was set for a shipping yard on the outskirts of the city, a place of shadows and heavy secrets, where the wind howled through concrete canyons. As T. Kyung stepped out of the car, the cold metal of his platinum watch felt heavier than usual, a physical manifestation of the terror he had been running from for years. He found himself surrounded not by investors in designer suits, but by his own lieutenants, their steel-gray eyes now locking onto him with a lethal clarity that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with blood business. "Where are the investors, David?" T. Kyung asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the air in the yard feel heavy. David let out a harsh, jagged laugh that cut through the rhythmic thrum of the rain. The investors are a myth, Tikayung. They think you've checked out. They think the tiger of Daegu has been tamed by personal matters and the ghost of a son he disowned years ago. He stepped into the light, a silhouette of hard edges that mirrored the man Tikayung used to be. We didn't build this empire so you could step back and restructure your soul. We built it on the surgical cut and the hollow luxury of power. You've become an embarrassment to the hierarchy. The betrayal was lethal and immovable, a strike from a predator in a perfectly tailored suit. Blades flashed in the amber glow of the street lamps as his own men turned their weapons on the man who had taught them that success requires commitment beyond feelings. Tikayung fought with lethal intensity, but he was outnumbered by the very shadows he had trained. As a blade found its mark in his side, the bone-deep chill of betrayal hit him harder than the steel. He realized in that shattering moment that his blood business possessed no blood loyalty. He had spent his life confusing being busy with being effective, building an empire of shadows, while his son built a home of warmth and resilience. He collapsed against a rain-slicked crate, his vision blurring into a haze of gray shadows, as his lieutenants turned their backs and left him to die in the freezing darkness. The king of the underground was now just a disposable ghost, abandoned in the cold streets by the very men who had once snapped into rigid bows at his command. The man who had disowned his son was about to learn the cost of being alone. The cold hit Tikayung like a physical slap as he stumbled away from the shipping yard, his breath turning into ragged plumes of silver mist that vanished into the predatory night. Every step he took made his expensive, thin-soled shoes sink deeper into the white blanket of snow, the slush seeping through the leather until his feet were numb, a sensation that mirrored the sudden, icy distance he had felt from his own life. He was no longer the king of the underground, whose authority was absolute. He was a man hunting for a truth that threatened to incinerate his entire existence, though now that truth was written in the blood blooming across his charcoal sweater. The stony and impassive mask he had worn for 40 years had been shattered by the blades of his own lieutenants, leaving him as a disposable ghost in a city that suddenly felt like an empty, frozen museum. He clutched his side, his fingers trembling so violently he could no longer feel his fingertips, the cold metal of his platinum watch now a mocking weight against his skin. The wind howled through the concrete canyons of Busan, a low, dangerous vibration that seemed to mock the power he had once used to silence boardrooms. He was experiencing the biting wind of being a disposable shadow, a person with no home, no money, and no voice in a world that measured worth in cold calculations. He remembered how he had pushed Alani into the snowy hallway years ago, the lock clicking with a finality that had broken her heart. Now, it was his own heart that felt like it was breaking into jagged pieces as the sub-zero air began to steal the last of his strength. His vision blurred, the world dissolving into a haze of gray shadows and swirling flakes. He found himself navigating a modest residential street in Busan, far from the gleaming, smart tech-filled penthouses of his past. The houses here were small, their windows glowing with a warm yellow light that reflected a belief in comfort he had long ago dismissed as a weakness. He felt a sharp, insistent need to find a sanctuary, yet he realized he had spent his life building fortresses of cold luxury that offered no warmth when the shadows truly gathered. He stumbled past a small bakery where the scent of fresh bread floated out into the cold, a sweet aroma that felt like a physical embrace he didn't deserve. With a final, shaky step, Tikayung's knees gave way. He collapsed onto the cold stone steps of a modest apartment building, his body trembling from the trauma of the snow and the bone-deep chill of his injuries. As he lay there, the floor beneath him radiating a steady, artificial cold rather than the heat of his custom-designed living room, he looked up at a third-floor window. Behind the sheer curtains, a shadow moved, the profile of a woman with auburn hair. It was Alani's fortress. He had spent 5 years celebrating his unencumbered freedom, yet here he was, dying on the doorstep of the miracle he had thrown away. The heavy silence of the street felt like a tomb. He was a man who had been running from the only legacy that actually mattered, and now he was a broken stranger at the mercy of the very woman he had branded an embarrassment. He closed his eyes, his breath hitching as he prepared for the final, absolute rejection. He was too used to suffering the quiet demands of his pride, but as the darkness closed in, he realized he didn't want to die as a king. He wanted to be seen, just once, as a man worthy of the fire. The tiger of Daegu was gone, replaced by a soul shivering in the cold, waiting for a door to open or for the snow to finally bury his tracks. The bone-deep chill that had threatened to claim Han Tae-kyung's life was replaced by the sterile, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the heavy, clinical scent of antiseptic. When his eyelashes finally fluttered open, his vision was a blur of fluorescent white light, a stark contrast to the freezing darkness of the Busan shipping yard. The tiger of Daegu had not died in the snow. Instead, he had been rushed into an emergency surgery to repair the jagged damage his own lieutenants had inflicted. For 48 hours, he had hovered in a fevered haze, his life sustained by the mechanical precision of a surgical team, a luxury of high-end medical care that was the only remnant of his former power. Once stable enough to be moved, Tae-kyung was not returned to his museum of isolation in Daegu, but was brought to the modest apartment on Choryongdong Street, where his recovery care began in earnest. He sat up on the long leather couch with a panicked gasp, his breath hitching as he looked at the pale, warm yellow walls that reflected a belief in light over marble and glass. The pain in his side was a sharp, insistent reminder of the betrayal, yet the atmosphere of the room hit his skin like a physical embrace. He watched in a heavy, contemplative silence as Baek Jung-kyung moved through the kitchen. His son was no longer the snap-to-attention heir of a violent hierarchy. He was a man focused on the toddler chaos of the morning, preparing a bottle with a coordination that spoke of 22 months of fierce, breathless love. Tae-kyung watched his son lift Yoon-sol, a little girl who inherited the tiger's own straight nose and stubborn chin, and realized that Jung-kyung had become a father who stays, a role Tae-kyung had never bothered to learn. "You should be resting," Alani said, her voice a melodic, grounding rumble that no longer made Tae-kyung flinch. She approached him with a tray of warm soup, the steam rising like a gentle peace offering. As she adjusted the cream-colored wool blanket, her own coat, around his shoulders, Tae-kyung saw the silent mark of her protection. Tae-kyung's eyes filled with tears as the crushing weight of his past choices finally broke through his mafia-bred armor. He looked at Jung-kyung, who was now sitting across from him, and then at Alani, the woman he had once called an embarrassment and pushed into the sub-zero night. "I was wrong," Tae-kyung whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, dark intensity. "I disowned you for choosing love but looking at this home. I realized I was the one who was poor. I spent my life building a tomb of cold luxury while you were building a fortress of light. Jung-kyung, Alani, I am sorry. I threw away a miracle because I was too small to handle the weight of your hearts." Jung-kyung didn't answer immediately, his gaze locked on his father with a surgical focus, the silence carrying years of pain. Forgiveness was not instant, but cruelty was no longer an option. He saw the stony and impassive mask finally dissolve into genuine regret, and his jaw softened. Alani sat beside him, her fingers tracing the rim of a teacup as she watched the man who had once tried to erase her existence. "Your pride cost us 5 years, father," Jung-kyung said quietly, his voice an anchoring weight. "But we don't leave people to die in the cold, not even the ones who forgot how to be human." Tae-kyung looked at the modest surroundings, the children's books on the reclaimed wood coffee table and the paper cranes in the corner, and felt a soaring sense of achievement that had nothing to do with money. He had billions of won, but he had entered this apartment as a broken stranger with nothing. In this warm room, under the gaze of the people he had misjudged, he was finally finding his footing as a man who knew what success actually meant. The fragile peace of the Choryongdong apartment was held together by the scent of warm cedarwood and the steady, rhythmic beeping of the city pulse outside. But Han Tae-kyung knew the heavy silence would not last. As he sat on the leather couch, his body still recovering from the mechanical precision of the surgery that had saved his life, he felt a jagged vibration in his soul. He was no longer the tiger of Daegu, who ruled with stony and impassive authority, but he still possessed the lethal intensity required to protect the fortress of light his son had built. He knew that David Chen and the other shadows, who moved through the Busan underground, would not stop until they had erased the memory of the man who had once been their king. Ti Kayung reached for his phone, his long, powerful fingers trembling slightly as he accessed a secure line he had kept hidden even from his most trusted men. It was time to perform one final, surgical, necessary cut. But this time, it was not to sever his family, but to excise the cancer of his former life. He spoke in a low, dangerous vibration, issuing orders to the few loyalists who remained in the shadows, men who valued consistency beyond feelings, and who understood that a legacy of presence was worth more than a hollow empire. He moved with a lethal clarity, dismantling his blood business piece by piece, ensuring that every asset and every secret was either neutralized or redirected to secure Jung Kyung and Alani's future. "What are you doing, father?" Jung Kyung asked, entering the kitchen as the morning sun began to filter through the sheer curtains. He looked at the platinum watch resting on the table, the cold metal weight that Ti Kayung had finally unbuckled from his wrist. "I am ensuring that the shadows never find this door," Ti Kayung replied, his voice an anchoring weight. "I have spent 40 years building a museum of isolation, but I will spend my last years making sure my granddaughter grows up in a world of orchestrated pandemonium rather than silent thrones." He looked at his son, seeing the soaring sense of achievement that came from being a father who stays, and felt a crushing weight of gratitude that he had been given a second-chance redemption. The empire did not fall quietly. Investigations tightened, assets vanished overnight, and men who once bowed to him turned away, proving loyalty had always been conditional. The final confrontation with David Chen happened not with a bang, but with a cold, calculated erasure of David's influence. Ti Kayung used his material evidence of success to bankrupt the traitors, leaving them as disposable ghosts in a city that no longer bowed to their names. When the work was done, Ti Kayung stepped down from his silent throne for the last time. He sold the Daegu penthouse and the midnight black sedan, trading the hollow luxury for a life that fit inside the pale, warm yellow walls of the family neighborhood. 2 years later, the atmosphere in the new house was a symphony of orchestrated pandemonium. 4-year-old Yoon Sol sat in her chair, announcing her non-negotiable opinions on the day's upcoming activities, while Alani moved through the kitchen with a melodic, soothing cadence. Ti Kayung appeared from the hallway, wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans that made him look younger and more approachable than he had ever been in his bespoke suits. He no longer carried the lethal intensity of a mafia sovereign. He carried a tray of mashed peas and a wooden block. As they walked toward the park, the spring sun casting a golden glow over the grass, Ti Kayung pushed Sol on the swings, marveling at the extraordinary joy found in something so simple. He looked at Alani and his son, realizing that he had finally found his true kingdom in the warmth of his granddaughter's smile. He had sacrificed his perspective for quarterly returns for too long, but now he chose the messy reality of a life truly lived. The tiger of Daegu was gone, replaced by a grandfather who chose to stay, and as the cherry blossoms began to bloom, he knew his redemption was finally complete.